The wallet was under table 17, not obviously visible, but partially hidden under a dropped napkin. And Elena Torres barely saw it as she cleaned up after a particularly brutal 12-hour shift at La Rosa, a mid-sized Italian restaurant where she worked 6 days a week, earning minimum wage plus tips that barely covered the rent of an inn. Apartment she shared with 2 roommates she rarely saw because they all worked staggered hours, all surviving in a city that consumed impoverished people and spat out bones without ceremony. She was exhausted, her feet aching in cheap shoes that needed replacing months ago, but replacements cost money she didn't have. Her back complaining from carrying heavy trays for hours without proper rest, and all she wanted was to go home, take a quick shower, fall into bed, and sleep for 6 hours before returning for another shift starting at 6 in the morning. But she saw the sheen of leather under the napkin. She saw it because she had been trained since childhood by the grandmother who raised her to notice details, to be careful, to never leave work half done because half-done work was a reflection of character. And even exhausted Elena couldn't simply ignore the forgotten wallet, because what kind of person ignored it? What kind of person saw something valuable lost and decided it wasn't their problem? So she bent down, picked up the wallet, and its weight immediately indicated that it wasn't empty, that it wasn't an old discarded wallet, but a current wallet probably containing documents and money and real significance to the owner who lost it. And Elena opened it to check identification, to find out who the owner was and how to return it, because that was the right thing to do. Even if a small voice, in her head, whispered about how much money was probably inside, about how much difference it would make in her life, about how nobody would know if she just took it. When she opened her wallet, Elena momentarily stopped breathing because what she saw didn't fit the atmosphere of La Rosa. It didn't fit the kind of clientele who frequented a family restaurant serving homemade pasta to middle-class families and couples on budget dates. There was money, lots of money. A wad of $100 bills so thick it probably totaled 5,000 or 6,000. There was a black credit card that Elena recognized from magazines as the kind millionaires used. There was a simple but expensive business card with just the name Alessandro Dante and a phone number in embossed silver letters. And there was a driver's license with a man's photo that Elena didn't immediately recognize, but something in her memory whispered that she should recognize. That she had seen the face before in some context she couldn't pinpoint through the fog of exhaustion. Elena quickly closed her wallet, as if she were about to burn herself, and looked around the nearly empty restaurant with only the cook cleaning the kitchen and the manager counting the cash register in the tiny office. She could icily slip her wallet into her pocket, walk out the door, and have enough money to pay 3 months' rent in advance, buy new shoes, and maybe even a decent winter coat because the one she had was falling apart. And winter was coming, cruel as it always was in a city where cold killed homeless people every year, and Elena was always 3 payments behind on becoming a statistic. But her hands didn't go to her pockets. They went to the counter where she dropped her wallet as if it were a venomous snake, and she stared at an object that represented a greater temptation than anything she had faced in 24 years of life marked by constant poverty and impossible choices. Marco, the manager, left the office at that moment, saw Elena standing there looking at the wallet with a strange expression, and walked over to her curiously. "Did you find anything?" he asked, taking the wallet before Elena could answer, and she saw the exact moment he opened it and saw the name, saw the color drain from his face, saw his hands begin to tremble slightly because Marco clearly recognized the name even though Elena didn't. Marco knew who Alessandro Dante was in ways that terrified him just holding the man's wallet. "Shit," Marco whispered, a word so uncharacteristic of him, who was always professional and polite, that Elena blinked in surprise. Shit, this is Alessandro Dante's. Was he here tonight? Did you help him?" Elena tried to remember through a haze of exhaustion, tried to catalog dozens of faces she had served during her shift, tried to connect the photo on the driver's license to some real customer, and finally vaguely remembered a man at table 17, a man who had dined alone, who had ordered only a simple carbonara edition water, who had been polite but distant, who had left a generous but not excessive tip, who had not stood out in any way except perhaps for the suit he wore being a little too expensive for the environment. But Elena served so many people that details got mixed up, and she hadn't paid special attention. "I think so," she said uncertainly. "Table 17? Dined alone?" Marco nodded frantically, still clutching his wallet as if it were a bomb about to explode. "You don't know who he is," Marco said, not asking but stating the obvious. Elena Alessandro Dante is... He hesitated, as if saying his full name aloud invited bad luck. He's the head of the biggest criminal organization on the East Coast. He controls half the illegal businesses within a 200-kilometer radius. He's a man politicians fear and police avoid. He's the reason La Rosa never has problems with gangs or protection, because we pay a monthly fee to his organization, and in return, we're untouchable. And you? Marco looked at Elena with a mixture of horror and something that could be admiration. You found his wallet with probably thousands of dollars, and your first reaction was to leave it on the counter. Instead of pocketing it? Are you sane or crazy? Elena felt her stomach churn, because now that she knew who Alessandro Dante was, now that the context was clear, the situation had become 100 times more complex than a simple moral decision about returning lost property. Men like Alessandro Dante didn't lose wallets accidentally. Men like that were too careful, too controlled. And if the wallet was under the table where he had dinner, it was either because he intentionally left it, which didn't make sense, or someone stole it and dropped it when they recognized the owner, which also didn't make sense because why would a thief come to La Rosa? I'm not a saint, Elena finally said, her voice firmer than she expected. I'm just honest. And the wallet isn't mine, so it needs to go back to its owner. Simple as that. You have his number, right? The protection money? You can call and let him know we found it? Marco shook his head violently. It doesn't work like that. He said, we don't call him directly, ever. We call an intermediary who calls another intermediary who eventually gets the message through. But direct contact with Alessandro Dante doesn't happen for people like us. He looked at his wallet again, at the business card with the direct number. Except he left the number here, a number that presumably is a direct line. Which means, Marco looked at Elena with growing realization, means that maybe he wanted to be contacted directly. Maybe the wallet wasn't lost accidentally. Maybe it was a test. The word test hung in the air between them, laden with implications that Elena didn't want to examine too closely, because if it was a test, if Alessandro Dante had deliberately left a wallet full of money to see what would happen, to see if the restaurant employees he protected were honest or opportunistic, then she had just passed by without knowing she was being tested. But it also meant that he was observing in some way that her choice hadn't. Been private, but watched, judged, evaluated, and that made the act of honesty feel less pure in some way, even if the intention had been genuine. You need to return it in person, Marco said, making his decision. I can't do that. I don't have the authority to contact him directly, but you found it. You're the one who'll want to see if it really was a test. Call the number, explain the situation, return the wallet, and Elena. He held her shoulders with hands that trembled slightly. Be extremely respectful, don't ask questions, don't ask for anything in return. Just return it and leave. Men like Alessandro Dante appreciate honesty, but also appreciate boundaries. And the appropriate boundary is silent gratitude, not an attempt to turn a good deed into an opportunity to ask for favors. Elena nodded, retrieved her wallet, picked up her cheap cell phone with a cracked screen, and dialed the number on the business card with fingers that trembled only slightly, because now that adrenaline was beginning to overcome exhaustion, she was realizing the magnitude of the situation. She was realizing that she was about to have direct contact with the most powerful criminal in the region because of a wallet she could have ignored, that she could have pocketed, that she could have left for the manager to handle. But instead, she had chosen a path of honesty that now put her in a position to speak with a man that most people actively avoided. The phone rang twice before being answered, a deep, controlled male voice that Elena vaguely recognized from a brief interaction when she served table 17, voice that said only Dante, as if a full name were unnecessary, because anyone calling that number would know exactly who they were speaking to. Mr. Dante? Elena said, forcing her voice to remain steady. My name is Elena Torres. I work as a waitress at La Rosa, and I found your wallet under the table after you had dinner here tonight. I would like to know how I can return it to you, with all its contents intact. There was a pause on the other end, a silence that lasted only seconds, but felt much longer, and when Alessandro finally answered, there was something in his tone that Elena couldn't quite identify, something that could be surprise or satisfaction, or a test continuing beyond simply returning her wallet. Are you at the restaurant now? He asked. I am, Elena confirmed. My shift just ended, but I'm still here cleaning up. Stay there, Alessandro ordered. Not rudely, but absolutely. I'll be back in 15 minutes. And, Miss Torres, he added before hanging up, Thank you for your honesty. It's a rare quality these days. It's appreciated. The call ended and Elena held the phone, trying to process what had just happened, trying to decide if she should be terrified or relieved or something in between, and Marco was looking at her with an expression that confirmed that yes, she should definitely be at least a little terrified because Alessandro Dante. Coming in person wasn't normal protocol, it was special attention. And special attention from a man like that could be a blessing or a curse, depending on his mood and the phase of the moon and 1,000 other factors impossible to predict or control. 15 minutes felt simultaneously like an eternity and an instant. Elena refused to sit down because sitting would mean relaxing, and relaxing would mean letting her guard down. She needed to be alert when Alessandro arrived. She needed to be prepared for anything, even without knowing what anything could mean in the context of returning a wallet to a criminal boss. Marco stayed with her. Silent solidarity or perhaps morbid curiosity about how the situation would unfold. And when the front door opened and Alessandro Dante entered, Elena immediately understood why he commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He was tall, easily 6 feet 3 inches, with a physique that suggested he maintained his shape not out of vanity, but out of practical necessity for a man who occasionally needed to use physical strength. His graying black hair at the temples made him look distinguished rather than old, perhaps in his early 40s. His face had a strong bone structure, a defined jawline, a small scar cutting across his left eyebrow that added obvious danger to his already intimidating appearance. And his eyes, God. His eyes were so dark brown they appeared black under the restaurant's soft lighting. They studied everything with the intensity of a predator who never stopped assessing his surroundings, never stopped calculating threats and opportunities, never fully relaxed, even in supposedly safe spaces. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Elena earned in 6 months, tailored perfectly to his physique. A navy blue so dark it appeared black except when the light caught it at a certain angle, and he moved with the absolute confidence of a man accustomed to commanding any room he entered, accustomed to people automatically deferring to him not out of politeness but out of well-founded fear of the consequences of not deferring. Behind him entered 2 men, clearly bodyguards, clearly armed under less expensive but still respectable suits. And they flanked the door as if expecting a threat to materialize even in an empty restaurant at a time when the entire city slept. Miss Torres, Alessandro said, focusing his attention completely on her in a way that made the rest of the world disappear, made Marco invisible, made bodyguards irrelevant. There was only her and him and the wallet she held as an inadequate shield between them. Thank you for waiting. I know your shift is over, and you must be eager to go home. Elena extended her wallet with hands that didn't tremble, because she refused to show fear even though fear was definitely present, whispering that she was way over her head, that she was dealing with dangerous people in ways she didn't fully understand. Here it is, she said simply. Everything that was inside is still there. I didn't touch anything except open it to check identification to see who the owner was. Alessandro took the wallet, opened it, checked the contents quickly but thoroughly, and Elena saw the moment he confirmed that yes, all the money was there, all the cards were there, nothing had been removed or touched except what was necessary to identify the owner. He closed the wallet, put it in his inside suit pocket, and then did something Elena didn't expect. He smiled, a small but genuine expression that transformed his entire face from intimidating to almost handsome, revealing that under danger there was a man capable of human warmth, even if he rarely chose to show it. You passed, Alessandro said, and the confirmation that it had been a test after all was like a punch in the gut, even though Elena already suspected it, because it meant that her honesty hadn't simply been a moral act in a vacuum, but a performance evaluated, judged, scored by an audience she didn't know existed. You passed a test that 90% of people fail, he continued. A test one conduct periodically with employees of establishments I protect. A simple test of leaving a wallet full of money and seeing what happens. Most pocket the money and discard the wallet. Some return the wallet but keep the money, claiming it was empty when they found it. Very few, he looked at her with something that could be considered respect. Very few return everything. Without hesitation, without even considering an alternative. Elena felt anger rising, replacing fear. She felt indignation at having been tested without consent, at having her honesty turned into a social experiment for the entertainment of a rich and powerful man who played with the lives of people struggling to survive. So this was a game, she said, unable to keep the edge of accusation out of her voice. You deliberately created a situation where desperate people earning minimum wage and barely able to pay bills, would be tempted with more money than they see in months, just to see if we would fail a moral test that you probably never had to face, because you were born into privilege and power. This isn't a test of character, it's cruelty. The silence that followed was absolute and tense. Marco making a strangled sound of horror because nobody spoke to Alessandro Dante like that. Nobody accused, nobody challenged, they didn't even want to keep breathing, but Alessandro didn't seem angry, he seemed intrigued, he seemed genuinely interested in being confronted in ways he probably rarely experienced because his position guaranteed automatic deference even when he didn't deserve it. You're angry, he observed. Angry that I tested you, angry that I used my position to assess your character without permission. That's valid. But Miss Torres, he took a step closer. Not threatening, but closing the distance in a way that made it impossible to avoid his intensity. You understand why I do this? Why I need to know who I can trust? I don't care about your justifications, Elena replied, refusing to back down, even though his proximity made her heart beat faster for reasons that were a mixture of fear and something more complicated she didn't want to name. You have power, you have money, you have resources to evaluate people in 1,000 different ways. But you chose a method that punishes poverty, that tests people at their most vulnerable moment, that transforms need into moral failure. So no, I don't think you deserve congratulations for discovering that an exhausted waitress returned her wallet. You deserve to question why the system you built requires tests like this in the first place. Alessandro studied her for a long moment, his expression revealing no thoughts, and then surprisingly he nodded as if agreeing with her criticism, as if accepting the validity of the argument in ways that a man in his position rarely accepted anything that challenged authority. You're right, he said simply. Test isn't perfect. It's predatory in certain ways, and its judgment is more about survival than morality. But you live in my world long enough, he added, his voice growing harsher. You see enough betrayals. You lose enough people to greed disguised as loyalty, and you become paranoid about trusting anyone. So yes, I test. It's not fair, but it keeps me alive. It keeps me in power. It keeps me able to protect those under my protection. And he focused on her again. You not only passed the test, you challenged me by conducting it. That demonstrates courage beyond honesty. That demonstrates conviction of principle that is even rarer than returning money. So what now? Elena asked, exhaustion finally returning now that the adrenaline was subsiding, making it difficult to hold on to anger, making it easier to just want the situation to end so she could go home and process everything. You tested me. I apparently passed you. Confronted me about justice and a test? And now what? Do I get a trophy? An honorable mention? Or do I just go back to working double shifts for tips while you go back to your empire built on activities we'd rather not examine too closely? Alessandro smiled again, his expression appreciative of her challenge. Now, he said, I offer an opportunity. I need someone trustworthy, someone with proven integrity and clearly unafraid to speak uncomfortable truths to powerful people. I need a personal assistant, someone who manages schedules, handles correspondence, keeps life organized. Pay is $10,000 a month to start, plus benefits, plus performance-based bonuses. The work is legitimate, he emphasized, seeing obvious skepticism on her face. I won't ask you to do anything illegal. I won't put you in danger. I just need someone competent and loyal, and tonight's test suggests you are both. $10,000 a month was more than Elena earned in 4 months at La Rosa. It was money that would completely change her life, allowing her to pay off debts, help her aging grandmother, and finally achieve the financial stability she had always dreamed of. But accepting would mean entering Alessandro's world, working for a criminal, crossing a moral line she had maintained her entire life, even when poverty made compromising principles tempting. I need to think, she said, rejecting an impulsive decision, even though part of her screamed to accept immediately before the offer was withdrawn. Alessandro nodded, respecting her hesitation in ways that surprised even him because normally, when he made an offer, he expected immediate acceptance. He expected gratitude, not careful consideration, as if his offer were something that required internal debate. Take all the time you need, he said. But Miss Torres, think about this. Working for me offers not only a better salary but real protection. No one will bother you. No one will threaten you, because you will be under my umbrella. And yes, the world I operate in has morally questionable aspects, but it also has a code. It has rules. It has honor of the kinds that the legal system pretends to have, but often fails to demonstrate. Think about what kind of life you want. One where you eternally fight for crumbs, or one where you have the resources to truly live. He handed her a business card. Different from the one in his wallet, this one with an additional number handwritten on it. Call me when you decide, he said, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't stay open indefinitely. And then he was leaving. Bodyguard opening the door and flanking the exit, and Elena stood there holding the card, staring at numbers that represented an impossible choice, a crossroads between the life she knew, difficult but morally simple, and the life being offered, complex but potentially transformative in ways that went beyond money, to include questions of identity and integrity and who she would choose. To become Marco waited until Alessandro had completely left before bursting into urgent whispers about how crazy she was for not accepting immediately, about how people would kill for an opportunity like that, about how questioning fortune when fortune presented itself was utter stupidity. But Elena wasn't listening fully. She was too busy processing the encounter, processing the test reveal, processing the offer that seemed too generous not to have hidden costs, not to eventually demand. Compromises she didn't want to make, not to transform her into something she didn't want to become. She finally went home on the nearly empty night bus, watching the city go by through a dirty window and thinking about Alessandro Dante, about the man who tested employees and offered jobs and lived in a parallel world where normal rules didn't apply, about how intimidating yet strangely respectful he had been, about how he had accepted her criticism in ways that powerful men rarely accepted. Anything. She thought about 10,000 a month, about what difference it would make, about how her grandmother could finally get proper medical treatment that inadequate public insurance didn't cover, about how Elena herself could perhaps finally go back to school and finish the education that had been interrupted when the money ran out. But she also thought about the line that would be crossed, about working for a criminal even if the work was legitimate, about the implicit commitment to accepting his world even while disagreeing with significant aspects, about what it meant to sell the honesty she had just demonstrated for a salary that would make survival easier, but her conscience more complicated. She didn't sleep much that night, turning the issue over in her mind repeatedly, examining it from every angle, trying to decide which weighed more, practical need or abstract principle. And when the sun rose 3 hours later, she still didn't have a definitive answer, but was clear about her next step. Elena called the number on the card at 9 in the morning. After a shift she'd worked on autopilot because her mind was too occupied with making decisions to properly focus on serving breakfasts and taking orders. And Alessandro answered on the second ring, as if he'd been expecting a call, as if he knew she would call even though Elena herself wasn't sure until the moment her fingers dialed. "Mr. Dante," she said, "I've made a decision. But before I share it, I need to ask questions. I need to understand exactly what I'm getting into. I need guarantees that go beyond vague promises about legality and protection." Alessandro agreed to meet in person, not at a restaurant, but at his office. An address in a business district that seemed completely respectable. A glass and steel building that housed dozens of legitimate businesses that he controlled directly or indirectly, and when Elena arrived at the appointed time, she was escorted by a polite receptionist to a private elevator that went straight up to the upper floor, where the office occupied an entire space. The decor masculine and expensive, but not ostentatious. Functional with touches of sophistication that suggested that Alessandro appreciated quality, but did not need to display wealth to validate power. He greeted her personally, a gesture of respect that Elena appreciated even while maintaining her high guard, and indicated comfortable chairs near the window with a breathtaking view of the city. They sat as if they were equals, negotiating a contract, rather than a powerful criminal offering a job to a desperate waitress. "Ask your questions," Alessandro said. "No restrictions, no forbidden areas. You deserve to know completely what you're getting into before committing." Elena had a mental list prepared. Questions she had refined during a sleepless night, and she began systematically. First, would the work be truly legitimate, or would she eventually expect to participate in illegal activities? Alessandro answered without hesitation, completely legitimate. You would manage legal business agendas, correspondence related to properly registered companies, meetings with lawyers and accountants, and reputable business partners. I will never ask you to touch illegal aspects of operations. I will never put you in a position where knowledge would make you complicit. Compartmentalization is how I protect people working for me. Second question. If I witness something illegal or discover it accidentally, what is the expectation? Alessandro considered carefully before answering. The expectation is discretion, but not participation. If you see something, you are not expected to report it, but you are also not expected to actively help or conceal it. Simply keep it to yourself and allow me to handle it. Fair treatment is that you have plausible deniability about anything serious, so I would structure work to maximize distance from anything that could create legal problems. For you, third, how does leaving work? Can I leave the job if I decide it's not working? Or is it a lifelong commitment like a traditional mafia where once you're in, you never leave? Alessandro almost laughed at that. You can leave whenever you want, he said. I'm not a movie monster keeping prisoners. If you decide after a week, a month, or a year that it's not working, you give reasonable notice, train a replacement, and leave on good terms. So the only requirement is continued confidentiality about anything you learned while working for me, but that would be formalized in a legal contract with a standard non-disclosure clause. Questions continued for hours, Elena testing limits and expectations, Alessandro responding with a patience he rarely displayed, because most people didn't dare question so thoroughly, didn't dare demand clarity before accepting his generosity. And he found that he respected that immensely, respected that she treated decisions with the seriousness they deserved, instead of blindly jumping at an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. And when the questions finally ended, when Elena had exhausted her list and Alessandro had provided surprisingly honest and detailed answers, she finally gave the answer he was waiting for. I accept, she said, with conditions. I want a written contract documenting everything we discussed. I want quarterly performance reviews where I can express concerns without fear of retaliation, and I want assurance that if at any point I feel that moral lines are being crossed in unacceptable ways, I can leave immediately without notice, provided I maintain confidentiality. Alessandro extended his hand, a small smile indicating satisfaction with her negotiation. I agree to everything, he said. You're smarter than most of the lawyers I hire. You'll do very well here. The handshake was firm, professional, but Elena felt an electricity in the contact that wasn't appropriate for a business situation. She felt something passed between them that suggested their dynamic would be more complex than simply employer and employee. And when their eyes met, she saw that Alessandro had felt it too, saw a recognition of a chemical attraction that shouldn't exist but did anyway. Inconvenient and potentially complicating but undeniable. The following months were a period of intense adjustment, Elena learning the steep curve of managing the life of a man who operated simultaneously in legitimate and criminal worlds, who had meetings with corporate CEOs in the morning and meetings with compromised union leaders in the afternoon, who treated everyone with the same superficial charm but constantly calculated advantages and vulnerabilities, who lived through absolute control but occasionally let his mask slip when he was alone with Elena, when he thought he wasn't being observed, but she always watched because her job was to anticipate needs, and it's impossible to anticipate without understanding. And she discovered layers of Alessandro that the initial test hadn't revealed. She discovered that he read philosophy before bed, that he anonymously donated to charities helping children in difficult situations because his own childhood had been traumatic, a trauma he rarely discussed but which clearly shaped his worldview, that he was capable of surprising kindness when he thought no one would notice, but Elena always did. Like when he secretly paid the medical debt of a low-level employee who would never know Alessandro was responsible for it so he could pay for his wife's cancer treatment. Or when he ensured that the family of a soldier who died in a botched operation received ongoing financial support, even though he had no legal obligation to do so. And Elena found herself admiring the man she should fear, developing feelings that were completely inappropriate for a professional relationship, looking at him longer than necessary when he was focused on work and not noticing her attention, imagining what would be different if they had met under different circumstances, if she didn't work for him, if the power dynamic wasn't so unbalanced, if the passion she was developing could be reciprocated without the impossible complications that a romantic relationship with a criminal employer would inevitably bring. And Alessandro, for his part, was facing a similar dilemma. He was discovering that Elena had become more essential than any previous assistant, not just because of her competence, although she was exceptionally competent, but because her presence made days better, made work less lonely, made the empire he had built feel less empty when she was around, making him laugh with dry observations about the absurdity of certain situations, challenging decisions when she thought he was being unfair or short-sighted, treating him as a human being instead of the intimidating icon the rest of the world saw. It was after 8 months that everything changed, after a particularly tense meeting where Alessandro had been forced to order retaliation against a rival who had crossed the line, where violence that he usually delegated had needed to be witnessed personally to send the appropriate message. And he returned to the office visibly disturbed in ways he rarely showed. And Elena saw not a dangerous man, but a human being struggling with the weight of choices that his position demanded, struggling with the moral cost of maintaining power through methods that part of him clearly hated even while acknowledging their necessity. She didn't ask what happened. She knew she shouldn't. She knew some things were compartmentalized for a reason. But when Alessandro collapsed into a chair, looking exhausted in ways that went beyond the physical, she did the only thing that felt right. She approached him, placed her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of comfort that was completely unprofessional but completely human, and whispered, "You don't have to carry everything alone. It's okay to be vulnerable occasionally. It doesn't make you weak, it makes you human." Alessandro looked up, looked at her with an expression of surprise mixed with something deeper, more needy, and then he was standing up, closing the distance between them, holding her face in his hands with a gentleness that contrasted absolutely with the violence he had just orchestrated, and he was saying what they had both been avoiding admitting for months. "I'm in love with you," he said, words coming out like a confession torn from his chest, like a secret he could no longer keep. "I know it's completely inappropriate. I know the dynamic is all wrong. I know you work for me and that creates impossible complications, but Elena, you've become the most important person in my life, and I can no longer pretend it's just professional, that I don't think about you constantly, that I don't want anything more than competent assistance." Elena should have backed away, should have maintained professional boundaries, should have remembered that falling for her employer was a bad idea, and falling for a criminal was even worse. But when she looked into his eyes, when she saw the genuine vulnerability he showed only to her, when she recognized that her feelings were mirrored, she couldn't keep her distance, couldn't pretend she didn't want exactly what he was offering. "Me too," she whispered. "I'm in love with you too, and it's terrifying and wrong and completely inevitable. And I don't know how we make this work, but I want to try if you want to." And then they were kissing, months of tension finally released. And it was desperate and gentle simultaneously. It was Alessandro being careful because Elena was precious, and Elena being brave because love demanded courage, especially love like this, and when they separated, both breathing heavily. Alessandro pressed his forehead against hers and said, "I'll change everything. You can no longer work directly for me if we're going to have a relationship. The conflict of interest is too great, but I can offer you a different position. Manager of one of the legitimate companies, equal salary. No contact with questionable aspects of the empire, a life completely separate from the criminal side. Would you accept that? Would you accept a reorganization that allows us to have a relationship without the complication of an employer-employee dynamic?" Elena considered it, and the proposal made sense. It resolved a power imbalance that made their current relationship ethically impossible. But it was also a sacrifice because she liked working directly with Alessandro. She liked being at the center of his operations, even if only on his legitimate side. But love was worth the sacrifice, so she nodded. "I accept," she said, "as long as we understand that this is a leap of faith for both of us, that we are choosing something without guarantees, that it may not work, but it's worth trying." And they tried, with Alessandro reorganizing the structure to put Elena in a position where she reported to a trusted lieutenant instead of directly to him, where the work was completely legitimate, managing the high-end restaurant he owned, and their relationship blossomed outside the office, through dinners and conversations, and the gradual revelation of layers they both kept hidden. Alessandro sharing a brutal childhood story that forced him into crime to survive, and then discovered he was good at it in ways that were simultaneously a blessing and a curse. Elena sharing her own story of growing up poor but loved by her grandmother who taught her that integrity was worth more than wealth. That character was built through difficult choices. That returning a wallet full of money was the kind of test you administered to yourself, not to others. And when Alessandro finally met Elena's grandmother, a tiny 70-year-old woman who studied him with sharp eyes that saw through charm and power to assess true character, and then declared that he was welcome as long as he treated her granddaughter with the respect she deserved. Alessandro felt an acceptance he hadn't experienced in decades, felt that perhaps he could be more than a criminal, could be a worthy partner to the exceptional woman who had chosen to love him despite everything. And Elena never forgot that their relationship began with a test, with Alessandro deliberately creating situations to assess her character, but over time she came to appreciate that the test had revealed not only her honesty, but also his ability to recognize value when he saw it. His capacity to offer opportunities, even when society would say that a waitress and a mafia boss had no basis for a relationship. His capacity to grow and change and become a better man through the love of a woman who refused to accept anything less than the best version of him. And years later, when they were having dinner at La Rosa, where it all began, when Alessandro proposed to Elena, with a ring that was discreet but valuable, and a promise of a life together that would be complicated but full of true love, she said yes through happy tears, and joked that he should be grateful that she had returned the wallet that night, that her honesty had saved them both from consuming loneliness, that his test had revealed not only her character but initiated his transformation, that sometimes tests were cruel but necessary, that sometimes discovering the truth about someone was worth temporary manipulation, and that she forgave the test because the end result, a relationship built on mutual honesty and love, grown from the most unlikely encounter, was worth all the moral complexity of its origin, was worth crossing lines she thought were absolute, was worth learning that people were more complicated than simple categories of good or bad, that a criminal could love deeply, and a waitress could find happiness in a gray world where black and white rarely existed purely, and that wallet deliberately left under table 17 had bought not only a character test, but an entire future, an entire life, an entire love that neither of them planned, but both deserved.